October 12, 1943. 23,000 feet above the Rhineland's patchwork of frost-kissed fields and winding rivers, a B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 42-3067, christened Lucky Lady by her crew, jolted violently as a 20-millimeter cannon shell tore through its number 3 engine. Black smoke billowed from the cowling in thick, roiling clouds, darkening the pale blue sky around the aircraft like a spreading stain. Inside the cramped cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes felt the control yoke shudder uncontrollably in his gloved hands, the plane's nose dipping 15 degrees as it began to falter, the familiar hum of 4 engines reduced to a ragged, uneven growl. Behind him, in the radio room, Sergeant Mike Donnelly watched hydraulic fluid spray across the fuselage wall, a crimson-like streak that mirrored the desperate urgency of their situation. The fortress was dying, its metal bones weakened by battle, and they were still 140 miles from the safety of England's green shores. Above and to the right, First Lieutenant James Howell witnessed the chaos unfold from the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt. The fighter's silver fuselage, emblazoned with the name Jersey Thunder in bold black letters just below the canopy, banked sharply as he locked his gaze onto the crippled bomber. At 24, Howell was a lean, sun-weathered farm boy from rural New Jersey, his young face etched with the quiet resolve of someone who'd seen too much war in too short a time. He had 312 combat hours over Europe and 72 missions under his belt, each one a dance with death. And he knew exactly what happened to stragglers left behind. Easy prey for the German fighters that lurked like wolves in the skies. Yet the main bomber formation pressed onward without hesitation, their silver wings cutting through the smoke as if the struggling B-17 didn't exist. Standard procedure, Howell knew. One damaged aircraft couldn't compromise the entire group's mission. Hayes understood this harsh reality too, even as his co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, hunched over his instruments, pen scratching frantically on a notepad as he ran the grim calculations. 3 engines operational, maximum indicated speed likely 160 miles per hour, altitude bleeding away at 200 feet per minute, and German fighters already circling in the distance like hungry sharks. Howell keyed his radio, his voice steady as stone amid the howl of wind in the roar of his own engine. "Big friend, this is Jersey 27. I have you visual. Stay with me." Hayes's response crackled back over the static, tight with restrained tension and the weight of command. "Jersey, we're losing hydraulics. Number 3 is on fire. Can't maintain altitude." "Copy that, big friend. I'm not going anywhere," Howell replied, a promise he had no authorization to make, one that could cost him his life. His fuel gauge glowed dimly in the cockpit, showing just 58 minutes of fuel remaining, possibly less depending on how hard he pushed the throttle in the fights to come. The bomber crawled forward at 140 knots, England still 90 miles to the northwest. The math didn't favor anyone, not the struggling crew of the B-17, and not the lone P-47 pilot who'd chosen to stand between them and certain death. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier at Thorpe Abbotts, the sprawling airbase in Suffolk that was home to the 100th Bomb Group, known to its men as the Bloody 100th, for the heavy losses they'd endured. The morning air had been crisp and cool, carrying the smell of aviation fuel and burnt coffee as Hayes and his crew climbed aboard Lucky Lady. It was their 19th mission, a daylight precision strike against the critical, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, a target so vital to Germany's war machine that it had been dubbed the heart of the Reich. Intelligence reports had promised light resistance, assuring the pilots that the Luftwaffe was stretched thin and the flak defenses minimal. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. 320 B-17s had crossed the English Channel that morning, their formation stretching for miles like a silver armada. But as they neared the German border, the sky erupted with enemy fighters. Over 400 Luftwaffe Messerschmitt, Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, swarming upward from over a dozen airfields, their wings glinting in the sun as they closed in for the kill. The sky transformed into a slaughterhouse. Bombers fell in flames, spinning wildly toward the earth, trailing plumes of smoke, debris, and the occasional parachute of a crewman who'd managed to bail out. The P-47 escorts fought desperately, their .50 caliber machine guns chattering as they tangled with the German fighters. But their range was limited. At the German border, with fuel tanks nearly empty, they were forced to turn back, leaving the bombers to fend for themselves against the relentless onslaught. Hayes's bomber had taken its first hit during the bomb run as the crew released their payload of 500-pound high-explosive bombs onto the factory below. Flak bursts erupted beneath the aircraft like black flowers, shrapnel piercing its thin aluminum skin with a hail of metallic pings and crunches. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Eddie Martinez, a young Mexican-American from Los Angeles, known for his quick smile and steady aim, was struck by fragments in his left shoulder, the pain searing through him as blood soaked his flight jacket. The waist gunner, Corporal Tommy Briggs, a kid from Brooklyn barely out of high school, was knocked unconscious by a piece of shrapnel that dented his steel helmet. Miraculously, it failed to penetrate, saving his life. Then came the fighters, 4 FW-190s diving from the 11 o'clock high position, their wings glowing with the flash of cannon fire. The top turret gunner, Sergeant Paul Richter, a grizzled veteran from Pennsylvania with a scar across his cheek, unleashed a hail of .50 caliber rounds at the lead fighter, tracer fire arcing through the sky in a deadly red arc. The Focke-Wulf exploded mid-air, disintegrating into a shower of tumbling wreckage and fire, but the remaining three pressed their attack, their guns blazing. That's when the number 3 engine died, struck by a 20-millimeter shell that shredded its internal components, the propeller freezing for a moment before spinning uselessly in the wind. 15 minutes after leaving the target area, Hayes struggled to keep the aircraft level as it descended through 22,000 feet, the cold air seeping through the bullet holes in the fuselage, making the cockpit feel like a freezer. Morrison worked frantically to restart the damaged engine, flipping switches and adjusting controls. But the propeller windmilled uselessly, a silent testament to the damage. Worse, the hydraulics were failing. Without pressure, the gun turrets couldn't rotate, leaving the crew defenseless against further attacks, and the bomb bay doors hung partially open, their jagged edges catching the wind and creating crippling drag that pulled the plane downward faster. "Skipper," Morrison said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind, "we should tell them to bail out. It's only a matter of time before we go down." Hayes hesitated, his eyes fixed on the ground far below, stretching fields of occupied France, a land controlled by the enemy. Crewmen who bailed out faced capture as prisoners of war if they survived the treacherous descent, their lives reduced to years of hardship in a German stalag. Partisan fighters sometimes helped downed airmen escape, sneaking them across borders to safety, but the odds were slim, the risks enormous. And Martinez was wounded. Could he even manage to strap on a parachute, let alone pull the ripcord with a torn shoulder? Hayes thought of each man on his crew, their families back home, the promises they'd made to return, the lives they'd left behind. "Not yet," he finally said, his voice firm. "We stay with the plane as long as we can." Above them, Howell scanned the sky relentlessly, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, searching for any sign of enemy fighters. His 8.50 caliber machine guns were loaded and ready, the Thunderbolt carrying 3,400 rounds, enough for roughly 34 seconds of continuous fire. He'd already expended 600 rounds in an earlier engagement, chasing off a pair of Bf-109s that had targeted another bomber, leaving just 28 seconds of firepower to defend both himself and the crippled B-17. Then he saw movement at 2 o'clock, 3 Bf-109s, painted in splinter camouflage that blended with the clouds, approaching from the south, their pilots clearly having spotted the wounded bomber. Stragglers were easy kills, and the Luftwaffe pilots knew it well. They'd made a career of picking off damaged aircraft, turning mercy missions into massacres. Howell didn't hesitate. He advanced the throttle, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roaring to life as he banked hard to position himself between the bomber and the oncoming fighters, his P-47 accelerating to 300 knots, a silver streak cutting through the sky. The lead Messerschmitt pilot saw him coming and broke left, but it was too late. Howell lined up the shot, his crosshairs locking onto the German fighter's fuselage, and squeezed the trigger. all 8 guns erupting simultaneously with a deafening roar. Recoil shook the aircraft noticeably, spent shell casings streaming from the wings like silver rain as tracer rounds converged on the 109's engine. Solid hits. The German fighter's canopy shattered, metal tearing away from the cowling as white glycol coolant sprayed from the radiator, a telltale sign of fatal damage. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and plummeted, trailing a thick cloud of black smoke, while the other two 109s scattered, climbing for altitude. They'd expected an easy kill, not a skilled, determined defender. Regrouping at 25,000 feet, they circled, weighing their next move, unsure if the lone P-47 was worth the risk. Inside the bomber, the crew heard Howell's guns roar and realized they weren't alone, a wave of relief washing over them amid the fear. "Jersey, thanks for the save," Hayes transmitted, his voice softer now, tinged with gratitude. "But you're burning fuel. You should head home while you still can." "Negative, big friend. You've got company all the way to the fence," Howell replied, using fighter pilot slang for the English Channel, the invisible line that separated danger from safety, still 90 miles away. At the bomber's current speed, that meant 38 minutes of flight time. Howell checked his fuel gauge again. 42 minutes remaining. It would be close, dangerously close, a gamble with his life. But he didn't waver. The bomber continued its descent, dropping through 20,000 feet, then 19,000. The cold growing more intense, frost forming on the inside of the cockpit windows. Hayes fought to slow the fall, pulling back on the yoke until his arms ached. But physics was unforgiving. 3 engines couldn't sustain altitude with combat damage and a partially open bomb bay. The aircraft felt like a flying brick, sluggish and unresponsive. Each movement of the controls met with a delayed, jerky reaction. Morrison's efforts to restart the number 3 engine remained fruitless, the propeller spinning uselessly in the wind, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The hydraulics worsened by the minute, and the drag from the hanging bomb bay doors only accelerated their descent, pulling them closer to the ground and to the enemy with every passing second. At 18,000 feet, the bomber punched through a thin layer of clouds, plunging them into 30 seconds of blindness. Nothing but white mist surrounding the aircraft. Their only guides the flickering instrument readings on the dashboard. When they emerged into clear air, Howell immediately spotted new trouble. 5 more Bf-109s in a tight Vic formation, approaching from directly ahead at 12 o'clock level, their wings perfectly aligned, a textbook attack formation. The Germans had radioed for reinforcements. This was no longer a probing attack, but a coordinated strike to finish the job, to take down the straggler and the foolish fighter pilot who'd chosen to defend it. Howell reacted instantly, positioning his P-47 head-on against the enemy formation. A tactic that demanded nerves of steel, a suicide run in the eyes of most pilots. 2 aircraft hurtling toward each other at a combined closing speed of over 500 knots, every second critical, every mistake fatal. The German pilot saw the lone thunderbolt and hesitated, taken aback by the audacity of the move. 1 against 5 should have been a lopsided fight, a quick victory for the Luftwaffe. But this pilot had already downed one of their comrades and damaged another. At 3,000 yards, Howell opened fire, not to score a kill, but to disrupt their formation, make them flinch, and buy the bomber precious time. Tracer fire lanced through the sky like red lightning, and the lead Messerschmitt broke right, shattering the precise attack pattern. 2 fighters veered left, 2 right, and 2 pressed straight ahead. Their formation now scattered, their advantage lost. Howell singled out the rightmost 109, closing to 600 yards before firing again, his aim steady as he tracked the enemy's movements. The German pilot never saw the attack coming. 50 caliber bullets stitched across the fighter's wing root, tearing through the metal like tissue paper, severing critical control cables. Aerodynamic forces wrenched the wing upward, and the 109 tumbled end over end, disappearing into the clouds below, a faint puff of smoke marking its final resting place. But the remaining 4 fighters now attacked from multiple vectors, Howell unable to cover all approaches at once, his P-47 twisting and turning as he fought to fend them off. 2 109s dove on the bomber from 7 o'clock high, cannon fire sparkling from their wings like deadly fireworks, aiming for the already damaged fuselage. Inside the bomber, tail gunner Sergeant Walt Kendrick, an older man, 32, with a wife and 2 kids back in Ohio, had finally cleared the jam in his twin .50 caliber guns, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline as he worked the mechanism. He swung the turret toward the lead attacker and fired, rounds tearing into the fighter's engine, a shower of sparks erupting from the cowling. White smoke billowed from the German plane, and the Messerschmitt pulled up sharply, breaking away. But the second fighter pressed its attack, undeterred. 20-millimeter cannon shells raked across the bomber's left wing, punching through the aluminum skin in a line of jagged holes. One shell exploded in the number 2 fuel tank. Though nearly empty, residual vapors ignited, flames bursting from the wing, orange and hungry, threatening to consume the entire aircraft. "Fire in number 2!" Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with urgency as he reached for the engine fire suppression controls and yanked the handle hard. CO2 flooded the engine compartment, hissing as it met the flames, and the inferno flickered and died. But the damage was irreversible. The number 2 engine was destroyed, its propeller seizing in place with a loud metallic groan. The bomber now flew on just 2 engines, half its power gone, its descent accelerating to 250 feet per minute. Altitude plummeted through 11,000 feet as Hayes fought the controls, his arms burning with effort, struggling to counter the aircraft's violent left roll. The weight of the dead engines creating an unbalanced drag force that threatened to tip them over, to send them spinning into the ground. "Skipper, we gotta bail out," Morrison insisted, his voice louder this time, urgent, almost desperate. "We can't hold her much longer." Hayes shook his head, his jaw set, even as he felt the plane lurch beneath him. "Not yet. Jersey's still with us." And he was. Howell had engaged the remaining fighters in a savage dogfight at 10,000 feet. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction, known to pilots as the Jug for its tough, bulky frame, saving his life twice. Cannon shells struck his aircraft but failed to penetrate the thick armor plating behind the cockpit, the metal ringing like a bell but holding strong. One round tore through the left wing, missing the fuel tank by just 18 inches, a near miss that would have ended the fight instantly. Howell downed another Messerschmitt with a near-impossible deflection shot, catching the German pilot completely off guard as he banked hard to avoid a collision. The 109 exploded in a brief orange fireball, leaving a black smudge across the sky, and finally the remaining 3 German fighters broke off the attack and fled eastward. 3 aircraft lost or damaged in 5 minutes, the cost of pursuing the bomber too high, the risk of facing the determined P-47 pilot no longer worth the reward. Howell rejoined the bomber as it descended through 9,000 feet, his fuel gauge now showing just 11 minutes remaining, the needle hovering dangerously close to the red line. The English Channel was 42 miles ahead, and at the bomber's current speed of 120 knots, that meant 18 minutes of flight time, 7 minutes short of safety. Howell keyed his radio again, his voice still steady, but now tinged with the first hint of fatigue. "Big friend, I'm going to have to leave you soon. Fuel state critical. I can't make it much farther." There was a long pause before Hayes responded, his voice heavy with gratitude and regret. "Understood, Jersey. You've already done more than anyone could ask. More than anyone would expect. Get yourself home safe." "Negative. I'll stay with you as long as I can," Howell replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. In the bomber's cockpit, Morrison leaned toward Hayes, his voice low, almost a whisper so the other crewmen wouldn't hear. "He's going to crash trying to save us, Skipper. He knows he can't make it to the channel with us. He's going to die out here." Hayes knew it was true, the cruel math of the situation staring him in the face. If the P-47 pilot stayed with them all the way to the channel, he'd run out of fuel over enemy territory, forced to bail out or crash land in occupied France. Either way, becoming a prisoner of war, his freedom lost, his life forever changed. But Howell had made his choice, and Hayes knew there was no talking him out of it. The bomber dropped through 8,000 feet, its descent rate accelerating to 300 feet per minute, the ground growing closer, more detailed, farmhouses, roads, rivers all visible now, a reminder of how low they'd fallen. At this pace, they'd reach wave-top level before ever seeing the English coast. A water landing would likely tear the aircraft apart, its damaged frame unable to withstand the impact with the rough sea. Survival odds, even in calm seas, were barely 30%. And this bomber was barely holding together, its fuselage riddled with bullet holes, its engines failing, its systems crippled. In the radio room, Donnelly used the last of the hydraulic pressure to manually crank down the landing gear, a desperate precaution if they somehow made it to England's airfields, though both he and Hayes knew it was a long shot. With two engines gone and battle damage across the airframe, even a wheels-down landing would be a suicide attempt, the plane likely flipping or skidding off the runway and bursting into flames. At 7,000 feet, the French coast appeared on the horizon, a thin blue line separating land from sea. Beyond it, 35 miles of cold gray channel water, and beyond that, England. Safety, home, the promise of warm meals and dry beds. Howell's fuel gauge touched the red line, just 8 minutes remaining, maybe less, as gauges were unreliable at low fuel levels, their readings often optimistic. Below, the coastal town of Dieppe passed beneath them, its white houses and harbor visible even from this altitude, a reminder of the earlier Allied raid that had ended in disaster. German anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the coast opened fire as soon as they spotted the two aircraft, black flak bursts exploding around the bomber like deadly bubbles. Hayes jinked left, then right, yanking the control yoke hard, trying to spoil the gunner's aim, the plane lurching violently with each movement. One shell detonated close enough to rock the aircraft, shrapnel peppering the fuselage with a hail of metallic thuds. In the waistgun position, Corporal Briggs, now conscious again after being knocked out earlier, his head throbbing with pain, felt warm liquid running down his leg. He looked down, his stomach churning, blood dark and thick, soaking his flight pants. A piece of shrapnel had hit his thigh, not life-threatening but agonizing, the pain sharp and constant. "Waist gunner hit," someone shouted over the intercom, their voice tight with panic. "How bad?" Hayes demanded, his eyes never leaving the controls. "Not bad, skipper. I can still walk," Briggs replied, gritting his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm, not wanting to add to the crew's fear. At 6,000 feet, they crossed the French coastline and flew out over the English Channel, the land falling away behind them, the endless expanse of water stretching out before them. The water below was dark and menacing, moderate seas with white caps churning, cold, unforgiving, a graveyard for countless airmen who ditched there. Water temperature hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time before hypothermia set in just 20 minutes, even for the strongest men. Howell checked his fuel gauge one last time. 5 minutes remaining. The English coast was still 28 miles away. He'd run out of fuel 12 miles short of land, his plane becoming a glider in the middle of the ocean. He made his decision, no hesitation, no second thoughts. "Big friend, I'm heading for the deck, going to set her down in the water close to you. When you ditch, we'll be in the same area. Better chance for rescue that way," Howell transmitted, his voice calm, as if he were discussing the weather. Not a suicide mission. Hayes understood instantly what the P-47 pilot was planning. Instead of turning back to crash land in France and likely survive as a POW, Howell was choosing to ditch in the channel alongside them, risking death by hypothermia or drowning to stay until the end, to not abandon the men he'd promised to protect. "Jersey, negative. You can still make it back to France. You'll survive as a prisoner, but you'll survive," Hayes urged, his voice cracking with emotion. "Don't throw your life away for us. Not leaving you, big friend. We're going home together, or not at all," Howell replied firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. Inside the bomber, the crew heard the exchange over the intercom. 10 men who'd resigned themselves to death, who'd made their peace with never seeing their families again, now felt a flicker of hope, a spark of life in the darkness. Someone was staying with them. They weren't alone in their final moments. At 5,000 feet, Howell descended alongside the bomber, matching its descent rate, the two aircraft flying in formation, a silent bond between them. His fuel gauge showed 3 minutes left. The engine would cut out soon, any second now. When it did, he'd have just 90 seconds of gliding flight before hitting the water, the P-47's poor glide characteristics giving him little room for error. At 4,000 feet, Hayes scanned the horizon desperately. No rescue boats, no ships, no aircraft, just endless gray ocean, the sky blending into the water until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. At 3,000 feet, Howell's engine coughed once, a loud, ragged sound, the first sign of fuel starvation. He switched fuel tanks, hoping to squeeze 30 more seconds from residual fuel in the lines, his fingers fumbling slightly with the controls, the cold numbing his hands. At 2,000 feet, Hayes began the ditching checklist, Morrison reading off items in a mechanical, detached voice, professional to the end, even in the face of death. Crew, prepare for water landing. Assume crash positions. Impact in 90 seconds. In the tail section, Kendrick strapped himself in tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat until his knuckles turned white. In the radio room, Donnelly braced against the bulkhead, his eyes closed, whispering a prayer for his wife and kids back home. In the waist, Briggs and the other gunners wedged themselves between equipment racks, using duffel bags as cushions. In the ball turret, Martinez rotated his position horizontal, struggling to climb out, his injured shoulder screaming with pain. The turret would be a death trap in a water landing, filling with water instantly, trapping anyone inside. At 1,000 feet, Howell's engine coughed again, longer this time, more ragged, the power sputtering. The propeller windmilled for 2 seconds before power surged back briefly, a false reprieve. Hayes lined up into the wind, trying to minimize ground speed at impact as the bomber descended through 800 feet, 700, 600. Then Howell's engine quit entirely. The sudden silence was deafening. The Pratt & Whitney R2-800 that had roared for 3 hours, that had carried him through countless fights, gone quiet. The propeller continued to spin, but without power, the P-47 became an 8-ton glider with terrible glide characteristics, falling through the sky like a stone. Howell pushed the nose down immediately to maintain airspeed. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall and cartwheel, killing him instantly. Too fast, and the impact would tear off the wings, sending him plunging into the water. At 400 feet, Hayes pulled back on the yoke, flaring the bomber to slow its descent, the nose rising, airspeed bleeding off. 120 knots, 110, 100. Every second felt like an hour, the tension in the cockpit thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the bomber hit the water. The impact was catastrophic, a thunderous crash that shook the entire aircraft, the fuselage slamming into the wave tops with enough force to pop rivets and split seams. Water exploded upward in huge plumes, drenching the exterior of the plane, flooding the interior through every crack and hole. The bomber skipped once, twice, bouncing off the waves like a toy, then settled into the water and began sliding forward in a fountain of spray, its momentum carrying it farther from the point of impact. Inside, the crew was thrown forward against their restraints, the force of the impact knocking the breath from their lungs. Equipment tore loose from its mountings and became deadly projectiles, flying through the air and slamming into anything in their path. The bombardier, Lieutenant Carl Vickers, felt his shoulder dislocate as he slammed into the instrument panel, a sharp pain shooting through his arm. Martinez, still climbing out of the ball turret, was crushed when the turret collapsed on impact, his final gasp lost in the chaos. The aircraft slid for 300 yards before finally stopping, the water immediately beginning to pour through dozens of cracks and holes, rising rapidly. "Everybody out now! Move! Move! Move!" Hayes shouted, his voice hoarse, as he unbuckled his seatbelt and fought to stand, the plane tilting to the left as water rushed in through the damaged sections. The aircraft had maybe 2 minutes before it sank, taking anyone still inside with it. 200 yards away, Howell fought his own battle for survival. The P-47 hit the water nose first at 90 knots, the force of the impact slamming him against the instrument panel, his head striking the gun sight with a loud crack. Blood running into his eyes, blurring his vision. The engine, weighing over 2,000 pounds, drove downward like an anchor, pulling the nose of the plane under. The aircraft flipped forward, and Howell was trapped for a moment, water flooding the cockpit, cold, shockingly cold, seeping into his flight suit, sapping his strength. He gasped, swallowing water, and fumbled for the canopy release, his hands numb, his fingers refusing to cooperate. He pulled the emergency release handle with all his might, and the canopy separated with a loud pop, floating away. Water rushed in, filling the cockpit completely, and Howell pushed himself up and out, fighting against the weight of his flight gear and parachute, which felt like lead weights dragging him down. The aircraft was sinking fast, its fuselage disappearing beneath the waves, pulling him down with it. He struggled free just as the tail disappeared beneath the surface, his lungs burning for air. He surfaced, gasping, coughing up salt water, and saw the bomber 400 yards away. Men were jumping from the wings into the water, orange life rafts deploying. At least some of the emergency equipment still worked, a small miracle. Howell inflated his Mae West life vest and began swimming toward the bomber, every stroke in agony, the cold water sapping his strength, his flight boots feeling like concrete blocks on his feet. His arms burned, his legs ached, but he kept going, driven by the promise he'd made to stay with them. He reached the nearest life raft and hands pulled him aboard, strong hands that belonged to the men he'd fought so hard to protect. Hayes's face appeared above him, his expression a mix of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. "Jersey, you crazy bastard. You actually did it," Hayes said, his voice rough as he helped pull Howell fully onto the raft. Howell couldn't speak. He was shaking too hard from the cold, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Someone threw a wool blanket over him, and he pulled it tight around his shoulders, trying to stop the shaking. They counted heads. 8 men in the first raft, 3 in the second, 11 total. But there should be 10 bomber crew and 1 fighter pilot. That was 11. Everyone who'd made it out of the planes had survived the landing. Wait, someone was missing. "Where's Martinez?" Hayes demanded, his voice sharp, scanning the rafts, looking for the ball turret gunner's familiar face. Silence fell over the rafts, heavy and somber. Then Donnelly spoke quietly, his voice breaking. "He didn't make it out, Skipper. The ball turret. It collapsed on him during impact." Hayes closed his eyes, a wave of grief washing over him. 9 saved, 1 lost. The cruel, unforgiving math of war, numbers that represented lives, dreams, families torn apart. They floated in the cold channel water for 18 minutes before the RAF rescue launch found them. 18 minutes that felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into their bones, their teeth chattering, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Men recited prayers, some silently, some aloud. Some cried, tears freezing on their cheeks. Some just stared at the gray sky, lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the horror they'd just endured. When the British boat pulled alongside, its crew throwing ropes and ladders over the side, Hayes made sure Howell went first, lifting the exhausted fighter pilot onto the ladder, ignoring his own exhaustion and pain. "This man," Hayes told the British sailors, his voice filled with pride and gratitude. "This man stayed with us for 90 miles, fought off 20 enemy fighters, ran out of fuel, and ditched alongside us. He saved 9 lives today. He's a hero." The British captain looked at Howell, soaking wet and shivering violently, his face pale, his head bandaged, and nodded, saluting him. "Well done, Yank. Well done indeed." 3 days later, Howell received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in the United States Army Air Forces. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in combat against enemy forces, displaying unparalleled courage and selflessness in defending a crippled bomber against overwhelming odds, refusing to abandon its crew even when faced with certain death." Hayes and his crew attended the ceremony, standing at attention, their uniforms pressed, their faces solemn, as the medal was pinned to Howell's chest. Afterward, they gathered at a nearby pub, buying Howell drink after drink, telling stories, laughing through the tears, celebrating the lives they'd been given. Years after the war, Hayes was asked about that day over the Rhineland and the English Channel. He sat in his living room surrounded by photos of his crew, of Lucky Lady, of Howell, and said, "We were dead. We knew it. Everyone knew it. The formation had left us. The Germans were closing in. Our plane was falling apart. Then this pilot in a P-47 decided we weren't dying that day. He stayed with us when he should have left. He fought for us when the odds were impossible. He ditched in the ocean rather than leave us alone. That's not courage. That's something beyond courage. I don't have a word for it. All I know is that 9 men got to go home to their families because of him. James Howell returned to civilian life after the war, moving back to New Jersey, marrying his high school sweetheart, and working as a farmer, never speaking much about his combat service, never boasting about his medal. When people asked about the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his wall, he'd change the subject, shifting the focus to the men he'd served with, to the ones who hadn't come home. But the men of that B-17 crew never forgot. Every year until his death in 1998, Howell received Christmas cards from the families of the men he'd saved, cards filled with photos of children and grandchildren, of weddings and birthdays, of lives lived because of his courage. 9 lives, 90 miles. One decision that defined what it meant to be a warrior, to be a brother. The men who flew these missions, the bomber crews, the fighter pilots, the ones who fought in the skies over Europe, understood sacrifice in ways most of us never will. They flew into fire because someone had to. They stayed when they should have fled because brothers don't abandon brothers. They faced impossible odds, stared death in the face and kept going, driven by a sense of duty and loyalty that transcended fear. If this story moved you, honor their memory by subscribing to this channel. Share these stories with family and friends so these acts of heroism are never forgotten, so the names of men like James Howell and Robert Hayes and the crew of Lucky Lady are never lost to history. Next time, we'll tell you about the B-24 pilot who landed his burning bomber deep in enemy territory to save his trapped crew. Until then, remember them. Remember their courage. Remember their sacrifice.